Before talking about urban gamification anymore, though, I would like to spend a little bit of time on the so-called ludification of culture, because I believe it is a context that is very important to understand if we want to talk about gamification and the cultural impact of games. So ludification of culture is a term that originated from the beginning of the 2000s, from the first years of the 2000s, and it indicates a ludic turn. It indicates a change of paradigm that have seen the prestige of games and play to increase in our society. This doesn't mean that we're playing more than in the past. It doesn't mean that play is more important. Play has been fundamental in every human society since forever. If we think about it, even for animals, play is fundamental. So play has always been important, but its prestige, the way in which we look at it, we frame it, we understanding is changed. Is a change that probably originated already from the Enlightenment with the work of philosophers like Friedrich Schiller and Rousseau that started to recognize the importance of playfulness in education. And it increased in the last few decades, also thanks to the success of digital games. So the ludification of culture, it indicates this new centrality of games and play, which enhances their cultural impact also on non-ludic contexts, on contexts that traditionally were not meant to be playful or related to play. Let's see a few examples. We can think, for example, of political activism. Political activism is becoming increasingly ludified to the sort of traditional protest marches. Today, we often prefer flash mobs, for example, or actions like the one in the right in which we use costumes to make certain points. So we use playful forms of expression also in political activism. We can think, for example, of food or kitchen appliances that become increasingly toyified. They look more like toys. This sort of material aspect and fun aspect of this object is becoming more and more important. We can think about fashion. Now the dress on the left sort of imitates early video games such as Space Invader. The one on the right imitates the pixelated graphics of some old video games. And so even a context that is generally considered pretty serious, even a bit stuck up, like fashion, use games and play as a way of innovate itself, to rethink new possible ways of creating products. And even in rituals, and even very serious rituals like funerals, we can see an increase of play-related phenomena. So this is a funeral, the funeral of a child. There is obviously nothing, light-hearted or joyful about it, but we still see a strong carnivalesque component in these pallbearers dressed up like superheroes. This is, of course, meant to be a sort of act of love towards the deceased and towards what were most likely his or her patients. But it's also interesting because it's something that 10, 20 years ago would have probably been considered very disrespectful, something too much unserious to find its place in a funeral. But today it sometimes does. And this shows how then ludification really is sort of an interstitial phenomenon that covers several parts of culture. And from a semiotic perspective, so thinking about how the ludification of culture deals with how we interpret and understand the meaning of things, we can say that this new prestige of play and games manifests itself as an increased modeling ability. So models are interesting things because models always have a sort of two-sided nature, right? So we can use models to understand things, to describe them. We can create the model of a city, for example, in order to try to understand how the city works. But we also create models as prototypes. We create models that we will then reproduce, that we will use as a sort of example to continue to create new things. And both these aspects of model are sort of evident in the ludification of culture. So on the one hand, games become a descriptive model. We use game to describe, to understand the the world, to understand and describe phenomena that are not necessarily related to play at all. It becomes sort of a universal metaphor. I will make just a very brief example, but if you think about the expression life coach, which is one of these, new jobs, well, life coach use the word coach that come from sports, so from games, the figure of someone that preps, that prepare and train someone to win a game, and it applies it to life. So according to the expression life coach, life is in fact a game, or at least it should be faced in the same way we face a game. And that's why we need a coach to prepare us to win at life. There could be many other examples. We can think, for example, how some politicians like to use the expression losers for their political opponents, which is again something very game related. Or how the word player has sort of expanded far beyond the simple act of playing. We can even think about projects like Blockholm, this reconstruction of the city of Stockholm in Minecraft, that again use it as a descriptive model. In order to better understand the city of Stockholm, we rebuild it completely inside a video game. On the other hand, then games also become prescriptive models. This is the basis of the idea that things would work better, they would be better, if they were more like games. This idea is obviously also known as gamification. Gamification is an attempt to make things more game-like, to use elements from game design, to use game design strategies, to create activities, applications, and so forth that are better at motivating, that are better at engaging, that are better at attracting users in, again, several different contexts. So what is important for me in the relationship between ludification of culture and gamification is that the ludification of culture explain the success and the efficacy of gamification and of other related phenomena such as game-based learning or serious games. It sort of tell us why gamification works. Gamification doesn't work because games are better at motivating people than other cultural forms. Gamification works because we live in a society, in a world in which games are more prestigious, in which we like games, we are avid players. The digital game industry, for example, has become the biggest entertainment industry on the planet. And that's exactly what gamification appeals to. It appeals to people that already think that games are cool, that games are interesting, that games are important. So the cultural nature of gamification reminds us that its efficacy is contextual. And that, for example, population that will not be necessarily that involved with games might not appreciate gamification. Gamification could, in some cases, not really work with them. At the same time, we can also know that, for example, some form of gamification wouldn't have worked 10 years ago. And we don't know how far in the future the ludification of culture will continue. And so how far gamification will continue to be efficient as it is today. So the first takeaway of my presentation is this, that gamification has to be understood in the context of cultural change. It is something that is happening now, and it's happening now for a reason, we can say. So we can move now to the second part of my presentation that will be dedicated more to urban gamification. But before, again, delving in what urban gamification is, let's spend a couple of words on gamification itself. So there are many different ways of defining gamification. There are many different definitions. My favorite one is the one that sees gamification as an attempt to design or to create affordances for a playful experience in a non-game context. I like this definition because it's quite broad. It doesn't bring in game elements. It doesn't bring in specific application or activities. It just shows how we can sort of attempt to create the conditions for play to arise in non-game contexts. And that in however way we do it, by using real games, by gamifying an application, by simply allowing or affording play, we are still gamifying this non-game context. Gamification in the last decade has been widely successful. It has been used in education, it has been used in healthcare, it has been used in fitness and exercise, and of course it has been used in marketing for well, communication and fidelizations with the customers. So gamification is quite wide, but the core of it is, again, this attempt to create the right affordances for people to have a playful experience in a non-game context. So how this translates to a city, how this translates to the urban setting? Well, quite interestingly, because the city itself, the public space of the city, are already a non-game context that can be gamified if we bring playfulness in it. So every playful activity that invests public spaces, it is already a form of urban gamification. Of course, we play in cities also in private spaces. We play in our apartments and in our houses. We play in playgrounds, in parks. We play in arcades, in casinos, and so on and so forth. There are many spaces that are devoted to play. But when play gets out of the stadia, of the arcades, etc., and gets into the streets and gets into the public spaces, then it gamifies the city. It modifies the meaning of the city. There is a very simple example that I believe most of you might have played in the past, which is the game Do Not Walk on the Pavement Lines. When you're walking in the street and you just try to avoid walking on the pavement lines, or when you walk only on the white of a pedestrian crossing. This is undoubtedly a form of gamification. It takes an action that is sort of boring, moving through the city, and it makes a game out of it using the affordances that the city offers in order to make more entertaining a very simple action. I will show you a quick outline of several other examples of urban gamification so that you understand better what I'm talking about. So one of the most interesting and famous projects of urban gamification is Fun Theory by Volkswagen. They create a series of urban gamification activities or devices that are related to promote pro-social or healthy behavior. So in this image, you can see the piano staircase, which is a staircase that, sounds like a piano keyboard when you walk on it. And the idea is that people will prefer to use it, to jump on it, to try to play it, instead of using the escalator. And in this way, having a more healthy habit when they're going out of the tube. This is also related to the fun theory, is the world's deepest bin. It's a bin that when you throw garbage in it, goes something like. The idea is, again, that it makes fun something trivial, like throwing away trash. And in the promotional video, for example, they show how some people just started to look for trash in the park just to continue to throw things and continue to play with the bin. Another important hub of urban gamification is the so-called Playable Cities project from Bristol that promoted several urban gamification projects, and it in particular attempts to hack the smart city technologies to create moments of playfulness and of socialization in the city. This one in the picture is Hello Lamppost, in which people can send and receive text messages with urban furniture, so mailboxes, lampposts, garbage bins, etc. And this other one is a project called Shadowing. It's a lamppost that use a very strong light and records the shadows of the people that pass under it, and then plays back these shadows a few seconds later. So you pass in the light, and 3-4 seconds later, your shadow passes in the light again. And this, again, generally provokes people to stop, to wonder what's going on, and often to aggregate around the light and try to play with the shadows and to see what they can make happen. I noticed in the program that yesterday, some of you already discussed a bit about do-it-yourself and do-it-yourself in urbanism. Do-it-yourself urbanism is a quite wide umbrella term, and it covers several different activities. But it's quite interesting that several of them have a rather strong playful component. For example, this carpet that becomes a pedestrian crossing that you can use wherever you want is sort of a tongue-in-cheek way of dealing with urban spaces. Or, for example, this swing installed in a bus stop is, again, a very playful way to change the affordances of a very simple and very common urban object like a bus stop. Or we can think of things like yarn bombing, in which people cover with colorful and warm yarn different things in the city. We then have also specific projects, like, for example, Parking Day. Parking Day is a sort of recurrence in which people would rent a parking spot, a parking slot, and instead of park their car there, they build a small park. So this is obviously a political dimension about, well, the use and the allocation of urban space, and a critique of how much of this space is dedicated to cars. But at the same time is also a very interesting form of pretend play that allows citizens to reappropriate a small portion of the city while they're doing this. Also, phenomena like flash mobs have a strong performative play component. Flash mobs have been used for all sorts of activities. We have things like zombie walks that are purely carnivalesque and fun. We have flash mobs, as I mentioned, that have a political component, and they are meant to embody a political protest. We have flash mobs that are used for marketing also. Several big companies try to use the power of flash mobs to promote their products. And, well, they work exactly because of this pervasive nature of play, because they mix in a normal everyday situation an unexpected moment of play, and this attracts the interest of the people around them. We have then phenomena like Parkour, born in the peripheries of Paris, as a sort of response to a very top-down and a very authoritative way of conducting urbanism. And so it's, again, a critique to a certain way of building neighborhoods and buildings that use them in a playful way, that sort of misbehave and use these obstacles as support for this acrobatic and free movement. We have finally also a very well-known phenomena like skateboarding that very often invades spaces that are not meant for skateboarding, that uses monuments, that uses staircase in order to do acrobacies and to play, and invades, again, non-play spaces with playful behavior. And finally, we have pride parades, which are highly carnivalesque forms of political protest that promote equality and a particular view on society, and do so by using very strongly playful elements. So we have seen here that urban gamification in these examples can take many different forms. It can be, for example, spontaneous. In some cases, it's just, you know, something that happens because citizens or someone, some individual make it happen. But it can also be designed. In some cases, we need a lot of expertise, like, for example, in the Playable Cities examples, we need a lot of expertise and of technology and of resources to create this example of urban gamification. It can be bottom-up. In some cases, it's really citizens and communities that organize these forms of play to reappropriate their cities. Or it can be top-down, as for example, in the fun theory, in which we have this almost paternalistic approach to urban gamification, which someone decides to trick, basically, people to behave in a pro-social way by making it fun. It can be forms of individual play, in which just one person play with the city, or it can be collective. It can need a lot of people, like, for example, in Pride Parade. It can be digital. It can require digital technologies, like, for example, in fan theory and in the Playable Cities, or it can be completely analog. It can need just your body, as it's in the case of Parkour. So we have many, many different layers and levels of what urban gamification can do. What is important, however, and this is our second takeaway, is that urban gamification, although can take many shapes, it always changes the everyday meaning of the urban space. So every form of urban gamification brings people out of their ordinary life way of looking at the city and modify the way that they see, that they interpret, that they behave within the urban space. In the last part of my presentation, I would like to engage with a particular challenging, but I think also particularly interesting form of urban gamification. That is urban gamification during the pandemic. So we are all, well, painfully aware of how COVID-19 outbreak and the pandemic have modified deeply our relationship with the urban spaces. Different kind of restriction measures have been put in place in several countries, among which my native countries of Italy and France, in which curfews and total lockdowns are again today in place. So this obviously has a strong effect on how we can move in cities and how we can relate and have relationship and interact with urban spaces. And of course, to limit the spread of the virus, many of the borders of the city have been strongly reinforced. Often we cannot go out, or we cannot go out after a certain hour. We need to wear masks, therefore reinforcing our bodily borders with the environment. So there have been many kinds of limitations to our movement. This would seem as, you know, a terrible moment to play with the city because we don't really have access to it. So we would imagine that urban gamification is sort of slowed down or stopped during COVID-19 first and now second wave. Well, this is not exactly what happened because, interestingly enough, borders, even if they have sort of a bad reputation, are indeed ideal places or spaces to play in. For example, semiotician Yuri Lockman claims that borders are particularly creative spaces, that borders are very innovative because they allow you to, well, invent and to be creative and to go beyond what is the status quo. Or for example, Victor Turner's concept of liminality indicates to us that liminal spaces often work as a magic circle. Liminal spaces are spaces of border etymologically, and they are spaces of indeterminacy. And everything that is indeterminate can be appropriate quite easily by play. And of course, why would we need play during lockdown and during the pandemic? Well, of course, we all know that the pandemic is a very stressful situation. It is often a tragic situation. And play, on the one hand, can help the mental health of citizens, can help them go through these tiring times. And at the same time, community play, social play in the city during the lockdown, translates quite directly in urban resilience towards these events. So again, I would like to show you now what I mean when I say that urban gamification didn't stop it, and we have many cases of urban gamification during the pandemic. And to do so, I will show it according to the different borders, urban borders that they invest. So the first border is that of balconies. Balconies are interesting spaces because they are private spaces, but they literally hang on they're private spaces hanging on the public space. People are still in a private space, but they are highly visible from the public space. So they're an interesting space of border that, as we all know, become quite important during the first wave of the pandemic. We had these concerts, we have people singing in the balconies in Italy and in Spain, for example, sometimes imitated also in other countries. We have in the left picture these people toasting with their glasses on the point of very long sticks, toasting with their neighbors. So balconies again became sort of a stage in which people could perform playful acts and to connect and to see other people performing playful acts at the same time. We have then windows. Windows were also used in a similar way, but I'm also thinking about closed windows, windows that are basically spaces to look through. We have, for example, the Etsinale, the teddy bear challenge that originated here in Finland, that consisted in putting teddy bears in your windows for children outside to look. So here in Finland, there wasn't a real lockdown, but children couldn't go to school or see their friends. And so the idea was to comfort them by disseminating the city with toys and creating a sort of treasure hunt game in which children could just go around and discover all these teddy bears around the city. Also, the fact that you can light windows has been used in several cases to create shapes. We see heart shapes on the right from Helsinki, on the left from Las Vegas. They also use the auto lights to write Vegas strong. We add light spectacles or shows created, for example, in Wuhan, making use of the lights of several skyscrapers at the end of the Wuhan lockdown. but also in a bottom-up way in several Italian cities in which people would just frenetically turn on and off the lights of their apartments while blasting music through the windows in order to create a sort of festive environment. We have then rooftops, which are also an interesting space of border. It's a space that we don't usually use very often, also because it's often shared with the other inhabitants of the same building, but it again was used in a playful way during the pandemic. We can think, for example, of people playing sports. The image of the left become quite viral is two young tennis players playing tennis across the two rooftops where they're living at in northern Italy. And in the right is a video, it's not very visible, it's a video from Dominican Republic, in which there are several kids playing or passing around the baseball across different roofs. We also have the highly mediatized COVID romance, in which two people in Brooklyn connected by looking at each other from different rooftops and then using a drone to well, communicate with one another. We then have the bodies themselves and the borders of the bodies, so what we put in our face, like masks or clothes, etc., that have often been used in quite playful ways. We have, creative use of face masks or of different sort of disguises, also again used to block the spread of the virus. We had people try to, well, fool the lockdown by, for example, dressing like animals or bringing around flashes. We have on the other side people that try to reinforce the lockdown by wearing scary costumes. It was the Grim Reaper that was roaming the beaches of Florida, sort of trying to remind people that they should stay home in order to stay safe. And we have also the public spaces that, although were sort of off limits, were often involved in different forms of urban gamification, for example, by putting masks to statues or provide them with toilet paper when there was a toilet paper shortage. Also spaces devoted to play, like this is in San Clemente. It used to be a skateboard park that was filled with sand by the municipality in order to stop skaters to use it, and was immediately reappropriated by dirt bikers that found it a very entertaining place to, well, engage with their hobby. We have, for example, audiences in sport events that were replaced with toys, with robots, with mannequins, with, on the right, they're actually sex dolls. We have, finally, this sort of announcements in public spaces that make use of the popular meme, the pallbearer meme that was very popular during the first wave of the pandemic, to sort of discourage people from going outside. So again, we see many different types of urban gamification and many different types of borders that have been invested spontaneously and simultaneously by urban gamification. So before that, any municipality, any big organization would try to use and organize playful ways of dealing with the pandemic, we had these bottom-up forms of reappropriation of these borders, of renegotiation of these borders that appeared, that emerged everywhere in the world, and that allowed citizens to still feel, get a feeling of ownership and of belonging on the urban environment, thanks to these forms of play. So our third and last takeaway is that urban gamification is more powerful if it is bottom-up. Citizens are more engaged, they're more creative if we just, well, let them play. So to sum up and to conclude this presentation, we have gone through three main perspectives. The first one that deals with how ludicization of culture has to be understood as a context for gamification, that we need to understand gamification as part of the ludicization of culture. The second one is that urban gamification can be a tool to engage and to reshape the meaning of urban spaces, even without the need of physically transforming them. And the third one is that borders can be key points where playfulness can arise and prosper. And so we saw also three main takeaways. The first one is that gamification has to be understood in the context of cultural change. So that if we want to design urban gamification, if we want to use it, if we want to tap in its potential, we need to understand it within this context. And so to understand which people are more likely to be positively affected or engaged by it and which not, in which cases it's good, in which cases it's not to use urban gamification. The second one is that urban gamification can take many shapes, but that it always deals with, always changes the everyday meaning of urban spaces. So it's not just something that we can use to engage citizens or to try to control their behavior. It's something that profoundly affects how urban spaces are perceived, interpreted, and used by citizens. And the final one is that, as we just said, urban gamification is more powerful and engaging when it's bottom-up. And therefore that it would be more interesting, instead of, again, trying to control in a top-down way what the citizens do, to try to find ways to create affordances, to create spaces for them to play. And then to let them decide how to play and how to use play to reclaim, to reappropriate the urban spaces. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much. Please stay safe and, as always, stay playful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mattia, for especially raising in your last few slides, I think, some important takeaways that maybe we can engage with a little more specifically now too. And also remind that if people have questions, they can post them in the chat and we will try to moderate those. But maybe I can just start with something while the rest are gathering their thoughts, because I was thinking throughout your presentation, I was thinking two things. One is a term that you're using that I think is one of those loaded terms that we have to use carefully, which is about reappropriation and thinking about one of those challenges of games, which, as you pointed, I think in all the three summaries, about understanding the contexts for which, you know, play can happen and where meanings, the semiotics of a space will change, because it can happen that, you know, play creates, as you said, the kind of magic circle around which we draw the new rules and boundaries. And you also spoke of border places. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little about how to work from one of these bottom-up models where we are sure that we're understanding those contexts, you know, when we reappropriate them for games, and thinking about inclusive, you know, how we can be inclusive in our communities as designers and as players, because I think many of the people involved in this project are quite committed for thinking about, you know, democratic process, changing democratic processes and the ways in which we can be inclusive. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about even the challenges of that, or how we work towards inclusion and thinking about the design of spaces, and so that we don't appropriate in a way which sort of creates a top-down meaning change without being inclusive of the others.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very good point, and a very important one, because while being bottom up always sounds nice, it's always not the same as being democratic, right? Bottom up movements can appropriate and use spaces, but then not necessarily make them really open to everybody. For example, do-it-yourself urbanism has been often criticized for this. It has been called like a hipster form of gentrification, which you're still, you know, beautifying some parts of the city, and in the end making them unavailable for marginalized people, like, you know, ruffled sleepers, etc. So this is indeed one of the biggest challenge, and it's always a challenge when you sort of give up some of the direction on your project. So in traditional forms of gamification, in which you have a very clear objective of behavior change that you want to achieve by gamifying something, you are still controlling what the people will do. You're trying at least to control what the people will do. If you use this form of, let's say, punk gamification, in which you try instead to, you know, allow play but not control it, you also have to deal with the fact that the consequence might be unexpected. And that, again, while we all agree that play has a lot of potential, play has not only potential for good, but also potential for bad. And bullying is a form of play. If you look at the internet, there are many playful forms of interaction that are highly toxic. So I think that the only way to deal with this challenge is to do it on a very empirical level, in the sense that often part of the success, at least, of gamification was due to the fact that it sounds like a magic formula. Tell you, you have these things, and if you use it, things will work better, people will be engaged, it will be very interesting. And that doesn't work. And this has become a project because a problem because then we have so many projects of gamification that do not work exactly because they sort of followed blindly a sort of recipe that is not really a recipe. Every form of gamification is still design. It requires authorship, it requires skills, it requires tacit knowledge, it requires iterations, it requires ways of knowing how to do things that are tailored on a certain city, if we speak about urban gamification, a certain neighborhood, a certain population, a certain context, and so on and so forth. So my main suggestion to deal with these things would be not to design alone, to use instead forms of participatory design in which you involve the communities, the citizens, the different stakeholders themselves in the design of the gamified activity or the gamifying enabling infrastructure that you might want to build. Again, I think that it's important to go beyond this idea that we know better, but at the same time that we cannot be sure that if we just leave it to the citizens, it will be all right. So we sort of have to negotiate our role as facilitators in all this, if we are designers and if we want to engage with the city, but really to try to involve horizontally all sort of organization, etc., that represent really all the segments of the city. So not just, random citizens, but NGOs and associations that deal, for example, with immigrants, with gender issues, and so on. So to really try to pull and to bring together all the different perspectives that we need to create something that is truly bottom up and is not just, left to the mass.
Yes, thank you. I think that we've talked a little bit over the last couple of days about participatory design and co-design. And again, we're all grappling with the challenges of that too, because I think it also means that we have to be able to speak each other's languages in a sense, working. I mean, many of the projects that we've undertaken, we have these multidisciplinary levels where people who are working as game designers or game educators or just educators or working with other people who deal with urban planning, cultural planning. And so they aren't those sorts of quick fixes that we hope. I really liked what you said when you said that, as much as we want to think that games are about play and fun, they can also, be dangerous and marginalizing, and they can be used as positively for political positive moves, but they can also be ways to, to redirect behaviors in negative ways as well. So I do think it's a challenge, and I'm glad you said that too about participation and co-design and the challenges within that.
And it's quite interesting because in participation in co-design, again, play can become an important component, because you just say, it's difficult to speak the same language, which is very true. It's also difficult to be on the same level because you might have, you might want to involve also some people from the municipality. And if we are in a sort of serious environment, a serious setting, then there is an imbalance of power from the beginning. But if when we're co-designing, we are playing, then all players are on the same level. This is something that, for example, Ekim Tan says when she speaks about this collaborative, playful way of urban design that she developed. Because yes, when we sort of get out of the everyday roles and behaviors, then we can find a new common language, thanks to the fact that we're playing together. And we can also find a new way of socializing, of truly communicating with each other because of that. So I guess that there are, several layers in which play can be useful for urban design or cultural design.
Great. Sorry, a bit of a frog in my throat, I guess. So we have some questions from the chat that I think I'm going to start with. I, of course, have some questions as well, but we'll get to those later, maybe. So we have a question. Can you speak to the role of the commercialization of culture and gamification?
Okay. Well, the fact of commercialization in gamification in general has been often pointed out as a sort of weakness, almost a corruption of gamification. There is, at least in some academic environments, the idea that you are a sellout if you create a product through your research, especially if you come from the humanities or the social sciences. I guess this is a prejudice that is a bit also related to a sort of overestimation of how much of gamification actually becomes a way of making profit. Because at least in my experience, I would say that the vast majority of urban gamification projects do not attempt to create any form of commercialization. That said, if we want to make a project sustainable, it makes sense that it can also be economically sustainable. Also because many projects of urban gamification, and you can think about the ones that I showed you, for example, tend to be very short-term, tend to be things that we do once and then they will just, fade away. And on the one side, because we can sort of getting the habit of it. So, the piano staircase is interesting only the first week, but after 3 months, I will not care about the fact that the piano make any music anymore, but also because they're not always economically sustainable. So it does make sense to try to find also an economical way to keep them up. We can think, for example, of alternate reality games like Pokemon Go that also can create this sort of gamification of the urban spaces because people will engage them in a playful way. And although it is a free-to-play game, it has, paying content that allows the game to continue and to go on for several years. And if in many places it's not as popular as it was at the beginning, they still have several millions of players. So it's still quite engaging. I think, again, the challenge is to try to separate the game design from the commercialization aspect. Again, to try to stay ethical and not use the fact that we're trying to make something fun to sort of take the money from our users, but to make very clear when and why it is necessary to pay for something. And again, possibly following the example of Pokemon Go and similar games to create something that is sort of free to use, but that the people that want and can afford it might want, for example, for having cosmetic things, etc., to pay something and support the continuation of the game.
Great, thank you. Maybe I have like a tag-on question to that. I'm sorry for the people in the chat. I'm gonna take up some time here. So if I remember right, Pokemon Go, after a while, kind of translated into like Starbucks and different like local businesses and stuff like that, being able to essentially purchase or encourage Niantic, the developer, to make their location into a Pokestop, something that players are encouraged to visit. Do you feel like there are risks where some gamification solutions start kind of benign and even benevolent, and then maybe turn after a while, after they have brought players into it, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. I think it's always a risk. And for example, when I was talking about flash mobs and how, something that was truly bottom up was soon appropriated as a form of advertisement. And so if you look for flash mob now, if you Google it, you will find mostly people dancing, either promoted by the musical groups that, of course, create visibility for the music through that, or by, phone companies or whatever other companies. So I think it is something that we cannot necessarily stop, and that we need to struggle against all the time. Because yes, Pokemon Go was moved to, they moved their point to Starbucks, but also museums were able to, for example, there is the science fiction museum in Turin is taking care of a sort of abandoned park from the municipality, and they were able to move a Pokemon gym there, again, in order to bring people together. So if something, it can be reappropriated, we know that it will also be reappropriated for, bad reasons or commercial reasons or whatever. So it is something that we cannot, forbid from the beginning, but that we, again, also from a bottom-up way, but also as designers, can try to hinder as much as we can.
Yeah, that That's a good answer. Thank you. So I'm going to take them in order here. And one question from the Q&A was, what tools can be used to measure and identify the impact of an urban gamified activity?
This is a very good question, and it doesn't have neither a very good nor a very simple answer, in the sense that this brings us back to the idea of control. So, for example, some of the gamification or urban gamification activity I designed, I really have no clue how people will actually play or deal with what they did. For example, an urban game called Jurassic Tampere that I organized last year was mainly about disseminating small toy dinosaurs in the city. We disseminated more than 400 of them. And we don't really know what people did with them. We noticed that they disappeared after a while. We saw some people taking pictures or following us to check where we would put them when we were playing. But that's it. We don't have any idea what was the impact, what happened. We just know that, you know, people were interested enough to take them away, basically. And again, this is maybe a sort of extreme form of, you know, giving up the power on your game. You really just give triggers to be playful and don't know what happens. There can be cases in which it's possible, for example, to interview the participants. But again, this is something that I believe we should not be too afraid of. The fact that we cannot always know what the impact is. I know that, for example, if we work for municipalities or for universities, etc., we are under the pressure of showing that what we do works, that is useful, that is, you know, this utilitarian perspective in which we must, you know, motivate that what we're doing, it makes sense because it had this and this and that impact. So I recognize that we need to find tools to do it. But I think that in some cases we should also be free to just, you know, do it and sort of in our heart knowing that some impact will happen, but it is not measurable. It's not something that we can, you know, put in a grant application or in a report or something like that.
Yeah, that's probably the difficult part sometimes, to get get funding for things that are hard to really describe in a very, I guess, quantifiable way. There's some more questions here in the chat. I'm going to read them both at the same time because they're kind of similar. Do you see how such gaming and playing activities could translate in tangible political activity? And one follow-up to that is Belarus protests are a visible recent example of carnivalization of politics.
Yes, yes. And again, it's interesting how also in this case, we can see this sort of gamification of politics from both sides. We also have a top-down gamification of politics. They mentioned, for example, certain politicians insisting on the term losers, or to create really this sort of using the supporters as hooligans, as sport fans. And so to take even sort of the toxic part of the gaming culture within their political agenda. We can also think of movements like Gamergate that was also related to digital gaming. And it quite quickly became an harassment campaigns against the female game developers. So this form of, and it was using memes, and again, all a series of playful and gameful tools to bring about a very oppressive politics in the end. But we also have the Belarus protest. We have, well, Pride parades, for example. I think they're a very interesting, successful example of urban gamification because they've been going on for more than 50 years now. And they really have been an important part in reshaping the perception of public opinion of LGBTQ plus people. So again, gamification and play is a tool. It's really, again, about how we use it. And this is also why I was insisting a lot in the first part of the presentation on the ludicization of culture, because it is not something that is, you know, that belongs only to some of us. This is something that is really investing culture as a whole. And that, well, let's think, for example, of the so-called social credit system that is being put in place in China, which sort of gamifies the allegiance, the obedience to the government by giving points if, for example, you participate to their camps, or if you do whatever that's considered pro-social, but you could lose points by, for example, buying books on the internet that are considered, not appropriate by the government. This is a big form of gamification, and it's also very scary. It's a strong, 1984 Black Mirror vibe in it. So this is why I think it's very important that we continue study gamification and pervasive play right now, because it is something that is becoming so underground part of all our culture that we don't even see it anymore often. But if we can use the knowledge that we have been created in games and play, etc., to hack this cultural change and to be able to decode these processes, I think we can, do something good for the world in the end.
Yeah, no,
I wonder if we could maybe use that as a little bit of a transition to think about, I like what you said, that where we can hack and think about ways to do that, because I think the projects, now I'm thinking about Magda, who's here with us, and Carolina, who's also here, who've been working on their game of Gdansk, which they'll talk about more in depth in the next session with Björn moderating. But I'm just wondering, are any of these issues sort of speaking to you when we think about inclusivity, but all of that together?
Just before we go to game of Gdansk, what was just said about this gamification in political activism, we are witnessing it now in Gdansk and all over Poland, because there are women protests, very strong women protests. And some older generations couldn't understand this playful attitude of the protesters, of the demonstration, which are usually young people. So this was the playfulness of slogans, using the language from internet games for slogans, dancing, dressing up. So something that for us, solidarity movement generation would be not serious enough. But thanks for hearing that this is, I personally, I love it. But some people, treat it with reservation. But it's good to know that this is like a world trend and transition to the political activism. And this is a good argument in the discussions. So, this was something I wanted to start with. And now about the project we've been doing Gdansk within urban cultural planning. So game of Gdansk. Yes, I think that was one of our preconditions, so to speak, to when we talk about the game, that we don't do it as the project coordinators. We don't do the game and let others play. But we put on co-design of the game so that the participants really are co-designers. And perhaps I can ask Carolina, who is an expert on educational gaming, why is it so important for participants to be engaged? Why do you think it is important?
Yeah, now I'd like to express that this is really important matter, because our participants, which were youth from Gdańsk schools and also scouts as well, and we will talk about this later a little bit more. But now I want to tell that they were creators of the game. They have developed the game on their own with their own ideas. So we wanted to empower them and to have influence not only for the game, but also for the environment which they are living in the daily basis. So this was important goal for us, because this is what you've said also, that this is the generations that find games attractive. And this is something what appeals to them very much. They know the environment of the games, especially Minecraft, because we were working with Minecraft also. And we wanted them to use the game also in creative way, not only play the game, but to be developers on the game and to have different view of the game, and also by it, different view for the neighborhood they live in their whole life.
Yeah, if I could just follow up and speak to that, because I think that's so important, that so much of so much of what we're trying to think about and do is to understand that these kinds of playful interactions, whatever they be, whether they're in their protests and whether it's carnivalization or anything, have these true, deep, meaningful, often, not always, and that's the difference between them, but really material impacts within people's lived experiences and lives. And I think it's sometimes, I mean, again, talking about these borderlands, when we talk about play and when we talk about games, it's often so difficult to distinguish between these like actual material experiences and what matters in somebody's real life versus what's happening within a game, and how we can make sure that those are either interwoven together or that are separated when they need to be, so that we can step in and out of the experiences. And I think that's one of the big challenges, is to remember, again, those material ways. And so I'm just wondering if there are examples, or from anybody here to think about that, the ways in which we make sure, at least in some of these games that we've been interested in the kind of in the urban spaces, where they're invested with like an accurate kind of meaning, or where we make sure that, you know, the players and the designers are aware of the real circumstances. How do we do that? How do we incorporate them in?
Here, if I can just add to that, to our game, of course, that was also mentioned in the keynote now, that how should we negotiate between this very playful bottom-up attitude and facilitate the meaning somehow that you want to put into this game. And this was also our challenge, because the youth is mostly, somehow, I suppose it's because of their experience with video games. The stories, because we were working with the game book, so it's based on the plots. So for them, the most interesting plots are those with killing, with lots of aggression, and, you know, and somehow we wanted to negotiate. On the one hand, we wanted them to be creative, you know, and to put as much of their own story to the game. But on the other hand, we didn't want to be just another killing game, you know. So that was really a challenge. And then, of course, we wanted them very much to use. So one of our ways of offering also food for thought, so to speak, was building the database of resources. So with stories from the old suburb, the district where the project is sort of on which the project is focused. So help them to use this as a building blocks for imagination for the stories, these resources. So that was our answer. But also, unfortunately, stepping in when there was too much blood and gore in the story.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that. Björn and I, when we were doing workshops with kids, also working in Minecraft to recreate cultural heritage sites and so on, sort of Björn always began with a set of rules about playing well together and not blowing things up and sort of restricting. But it is interesting how those can be guided, and we saw how they can be helpful, but also how when you step out of the room, other things can happen too. And sometimes they're delightful and wonderful, and sometimes they're not exactly what you want, and you have to allow for that there too. Okay,
can I ask? So I think I have my main question then. So you said you have a favorite definition of gamification, right? Do you have like examples of definition to be kind, that you disagree with, or I guess your least favorite definitions?
I think my least favorite definition of gamification is that sees gamification as the use of game elements in non-game contexts, because I have a huge opposition to the idea that game elements are a thing. I don't think that you can break up a game in smaller parts. And I don't think that if you do, there are still games. Otherwise, you know, I can take a baseball bat and beat up my neighbor, and it's gamification of violence because I'm using a game element. That doesn't make sense to me. And it's a very formal approach to a much more organic process as that of gamification. And it's quite interesting because a lot of gamification examples sort of use this definition because, again, it's the easiest one. You have, a set of elements. You use badges, you use points, you use leaderboards. And if you put that, okay, now it's a game. But that's not how it works. It's not enough to make something playful to use any of these things. Many of these things do not really come from games either. I mean, we have points even in the economy. It doesn't make it that very playful. And it's, in the end, a sort of oversimplification of something that I believe is not out there. I don't think that games are a thing. Games are a way in which we deal with things, basically. And that is, in the end, the point of gamification, that we can deal with everything in this playful way, if we want, if someone helps or allows it. And so I think that in the end, the definition of gamification as use of game elements have done a lot of harm to gamification as a whole and to the success of gamification applications in the end.
Okay, I actually think we have a good closing question in the Q&A because it's about future predictions. What do you think the future of gamification is in the nearest years? Do you have any predictions or forecasts?
Well, I think that I'm not sure how successful the term will be, because I think that really gamification or the redistribution of culture is becoming a dimension of our culture that will almost become sort of invisible because it's integrated in most of the things around us. So I would say that the role of at least the academic research on gamification, which is what I do, in the next years will be really to be able to spot where gamification is and how it is influencing our behavior, our society, our politics, etc. And to try to make emerge the common points of gamification in different contexts. So not necessarily that much about learning how to design better gamification, because I believe that would sort of happen while the field matures, but still be able to see that it's there and not to normalize, because of course then it becomes sort of an ideological part of society that appears normal, it appears natural. And seeing that it's not natural and showing up that it's not natural is something that happens, that we have control over it, I think would be the big next challenge for gamification research.